The focus of this lecture is constitutionalism in Western Europe circa or round about 1589 to 1715. In the period 1589 to 1715, two basic forms of government emerged in Europe. Those two forms were absolutism, the subject of our previous lecture, and the second form is constitutionalism, which is the subject of this lecture. All subsequent governments have been modeled on one of these forms, absolutism or constitutionalism. As we saw in our previous lecture about absolutism, absolute monarchies were established in this period in France and in Spain. And, as we see today, Great Britain was an absolutist state also. Great Britain, however, underwent a glorious revolution in 1688 and 1689 and transformed into a constitutional state. That will be the focus, really, of this lecture. We will begin with a brief description of what a constitutional form of government is. We'll define it, talk about some of its characteristics, but we're going to focus largely on Great Britain's transformation from absolutism to constitutionalism in about a 100-year period from 1588 to 1689. Constitutionalism can be defined as a state in which there is limitation of government by law. In other words, the state is ruled by the law just as the people are. No one in a constitutional state is above the law, not even the government. Even government officials are subject to the law in a constitutional state. A constitutional government has to balance the power of the government and the rights of its subjects. Constitutional states also, obviously, have a constitution, which embodies the laws of that state. What you may not know is that a constitution can be written or unwritten or a little bit of both. Here in the United States of America, we're accustomed to a constitution that is fully written, but not every constitutional state has a constitution that is completely written down. An example of a country that has a constitution with both written and unwritten parts is the country of Great Britain. In Great Britain, some laws are just laws based on tradition and precedent. They may or may not be found in the Constitution or in the law code of that country. What is important to note here is that a constitutional state can be either a constitutional republic or a constitutional monarchy, but neither should be confused with a democracy. More about that in just a second. In a constitutional republic, power in that state rests with the electorate. That's just another way of saying the voting population. So in a constitutional republic, power rests with the voting population. Power is exercised by representatives chosen by the electorate or by the voters. An example of a constitutional republic would be the United States of America. In a constitutional monarchy, the king and or queen is head of state with very little real authority. In a constitutional monarchy, power rests again with the electorate or the voters. In a constitutional monarchy, the electorate or voters choose representatives to serve them in a representative body, usually called a parliament, that shares power with a king and or a queen who have their status as monarch based on hereditary right. Now, as I've said, a constitutional form of government should not be confused with the idea of democracy. In a democracy, as defined by the ancient Greek city-state or polis of Athens, all people have the right to participate in the government directly by holding office or indirectly by voting. But since most men could not vote until the 19th century and most women couldn't vote until the 20th century, full democratic governments have not been possible until very recently. Very recently, in modern times, democracy has been achievable, but it's still just an ideal. Democracy is founded on the ideas of majority rule, public debate, voting, participating in office. Those ideas are some of the inspirations in our country, but we are not a full democracy. Not every single person in our country votes. Not every single person in our country participates directly in governing by holding office. So democracy represents an idea and should not be confused with constitutionalism. So let's talk about England or Great Britain's transformation from absolutism to constitutional monarchy. Now that we have defined the difference, what we're going to see in the period from 1588 to 1689 is that Great Britain changes from a state in which all power is held by the king or queen, who feels responsible only to God for his or her actions, to a constitutional state in which all people, including the king and or queen, are subject to the law and the Constitution. How does this happen? Well, in the period from about 1588 to 1689, Great Britain starts as an absolutist country. Absolutism is their form of government. They eventually go through a period of bloody civil war, or the English Civil War from 1642 to 1649. That civil war ends abruptly with the execution of the king in 1649. At that point, in 1649, Great Britain no longer desires to have a monarchy of any kind. Instead, they try a military dictatorship and find that a military dictatorship is just another form of absolutism, and that absolute monarchy was preferable to a military dictatorship. So in 1660, they restore the monarchy in England. They have a problem with a couple of kings there in the process of this restored monarchy, which leads them through a glorious revolution from 1688 to 1689, and when that revolution ends, Great Britain has a constitution by which the king and or queen must subject themselves to the laws, as does the rest of that country. Therefore, at the end of the Glorious Revolution, England is a constitutional monarchy. We start our look at Great Britain's leaders in this period with Queen Elizabeth I, whose last name was Tudor. Elizabeth I, who reigned from 1558 to 1603, is known in history as the Virgin Queen. The use of the word virgin in this sense simply means that she was unmarried. She chose never to marry. More about that in just a second. Elizabeth was the daughter of Henry VIII, the famous Henry VIII, who married a total of 6 times in his quest to get a son. So Elizabeth was actually the daughter of Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth grew up in the shadows of her older stepsister, half-sister, Bloody Mary Tudor. So when Henry VIII died, he was succeeded briefly by his son, Edward. Edward was sickly and died. Edward was followed by Bloody Mary, or Mary Tudor, who was the daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife. So Bloody Mary had been the leader of England, its queen, during Elizabeth's early years. Elizabeth was everything that her sister, Bloody Mary, was not. Elizabeth was quite attractive, very popular, charismatic, likable, and Protestant. Mary, on the other hand, was older, certainly not attractive, Catholic, devoutly so. She earned her nickname Bloody Mary because she tried to bring back Catholicism to England, which her father, Henry VIII, had gotten rid of. So Mary was not fond of Elizabeth and often referred to her in some very unflattering terms. Elizabeth suddenly found herself propelled to the throne of England when Mary died in 1558 from a uterine tumor. Mary and her husband, who was the King of Spain, Philip II, thought that Mary was pregnant, but when she died, her doctors discovered that it was in fact not a child growing in her womb, but a cancerous tumor. Elizabeth suddenly became the Queen of England in 1558. She had hoped, when she became the Queen, to marry her boyfriend, we'll just say, who was a young noble by the name of Dudley. The advisors to Elizabeth rejected Dudley as a possible husband for Elizabeth because he was considered to be beneath her. While he was of noble status, he was certainly not a royal like Elizabeth, and Dudley and Elizabeth probably could have carried on their affair had Elizabeth never become queen. But her hand was up for grabs, so to speak, all around Europe. Various princes from France were interested in Elizabeth, as was her former brother-in-law, Philip II of Spain. Elizabeth chose not to marry. Since she could not marry for love, she would not marry at all. In fact, she wore a wedding band and said that she was married to her country of England rather than to any man. She had her heart set on Dudley, and if she couldn't have him, she would have no one. Elizabeth's early years were characterized by many problems. Her advisors often did not take her seriously because of her great beauty and her youthfulness, and also because she was unmarried. They would have preferred that Elizabeth had a husband to advise her behind the scenes. Elizabeth's major achievements include the following. When Elizabeth refused to marry her former brother-in-law, Philip II, he sided with a cousin of hers, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was the reigning Queen of Scotland, who also could claim the throne of England. Philip II and Mary, Queen of Scots, plotted against Elizabeth to take over the throne, essentially, and this is the highest crime a person can commit in England, and it's called treason. Mary, Queen of Scots, knew that by rebelling against Elizabeth or planning it or even thinking about it, she could be put to death for it by decapitation. When Elizabeth found out that her cousin was plotting against her to take the throne from her, she was dumbfounded, shocked, amazed. She never would have expected that from her cousin at all. They had had a good relationship growing up, but she had to prove that she had the stuff of a queen. So in 1587, Elizabeth had her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, the Queen of Scotland, beheaded on charges of treason. Philip II decided at that point, because Elizabeth had more or less aggravated him by rejecting his marriage proposal and sending pirates, men like Sir Francis Drake, to attack Spanish ships coming from the Americas loaded with gold and silver. She had antagonized Philip II, so he decided in 1588 to invade England. And in May, over the course of a few hours, May 9th, 1588, Elizabeth's much smaller navy defeated the huge galleys of Philip II. When the battle started, most would have assumed Philip would have won because Spain at this point was a major world power, but actually Elizabeth's smaller ships were able to outmaneuver the old galleys that Philip had chosen to send into the English Channel for this invasion. It's almost like Philip was overconfident about his abilities to win against Elizabeth, so he sent second-rate sailors and second-rate ships. Elizabeth won. Another achievement of Elizabeth is that she gave much support to a young playwright, a man named William Shakespeare, who was extremely popular during this period. Literature written during the reign of Elizabeth I is called Elizabethan literature. The greatest Elizabethan author was William Shakespeare. In 1603, Elizabeth, whom the English had fallen in love with, died. She died, of course, without an heir. Since she had never married, she had no children. It is ironic who she chose to be her heir. She chose her cousin from Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. Elizabeth had had Mary, Queen of Scots, beheaded for trying to take the throne from her. Now she gives the throne to marry Queen of Scots' son. This man is James. James was known as James VI in Scotland. He's already the king there when he is given the throne of England also in 1603. James is not a Tudor. His last name is Stuart, so he starts the Stuart line of kings in 1603 in England. His reign is lengthy from 1603 to 1625, but he too was plagued with problems. Unlike Elizabeth, who overcame early problems and became extremely loved, likable, popular, James never achieved popularity. In fact, he was extremely unpopular. Many reasons for this, and I'll just share a few of them with you. King James was very unpopular because he spoke with a Scottish accent. The English never accepted him as one of their own because of his accent. Furthermore, James I believed in the divine right of kings and absolutism, and he exerted his absolute power absolutely, threatening to take away long-held rights of the English people. For example, he threatened to confiscate English property. He also had somewhat of a questionable love life. He was married but had many affairs, some of them with individuals of the same sex as he. So his sexual promiscuity was something that the English people did not care for. At this time, the majority of the English people were of a Protestant group called Puritans, who were very strict and stern in their morality. They did not care for James I's free-loving ways. We'll just leave it at that. His life was a bit questionable to them in terms of his love affairs. Just too much for them. He was also unpopular because he squandered a great deal of money. He was extremely extravagant and on a number of occasions angered the House of Commons, who were becoming increasingly wealthy by threatening to take their property and other items for them. He also seemed to be tolerant of Catholicism, which the English had been trying to get rid of since Henry VIII. So James's significance in English history is that he antagonized the Parliament and the English people and funds the first real exploration of North America by the English that amounts to anything. The English had tried during the reign of Elizabeth to establish a colony in the New World in North America, around an area we know today as Virginia. It was not successful. That colony was called Roanoke, and something happened to it. Still remains a mystery to this day. The first English people who tried to settle at this place called Roanoke, and today what we would recognize as Virginia, went missing, and when supply ships came a couple of years after the first English had settled at Roanoke, they could not find them. They disappeared. For that reason, Roanoke is known as the Lost Colony. Under James, the English try again, and this time achieve success. In 1607, the English made their first permanent settlement in the New World, in North America. That town named for him was Jamestown in the state of Virginia, named for Queen Elizabeth. When James died, he was succeeded by his son Charles I, who inherited from his father the thrones of Scotland and England and a terrible relationship with Parliament, which he makes much worse. Charles's reign lasts from 1625 to 1649. His relationship with Parliament was tense when he became the King of England. He made it worse by ruling without Parliament in a period from 1629 to 1640. That's a total of 11 years. In that time period, Charles was essentially acting as an absolutist king, since he did not call Parliament into session a single time in 11 years. He was ruling without any care or thought as to what the English people wanted or needed. He was ruling as an absolutist king. In this time period, he had no money to finance his government. Parliament controlled the power of the purse, so to speak. It was Parliament that gave money to the king for his various projects. So one wonders, how did he finance a government? Through a tax called ship money. It had been traditional in England that people who lived along the coastline paid a yearly tax called ship money for defense of the coast. Charles increased that tax, extended it, somewhat illegally or beyond the law, extra legally, and used the extra money that he obtained from ship money to finance his government. But unfortunately, this did not work long term. In 1640, the Scots revolted against Charles I. They felt that they were being neglected and also possibly having Catholicism forced on them by Charles I. Charles I was trying to implement changes in the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, which many saw as being too much like Catholicism. And that's really not important for this discussion, but if you want to read about that, those specific things that Charles was trying to force on the Presbyterians that seemed like Catholicism, you can read about that in your textbook. It's really not important for this discussion. What we need to know for this discussion is that in 1640, the Scots revolted. Charles could not finance soldiers and a war against the Scots with ship money. He was forced at this point to call into session Parliament. He certainly did not want to do so. When this Parliament arrived in 1640, to say that they were frustrated would be an understatement. They disliked Charles. They felt as though they had been betrayed and now used. He called them only when he needed them. So this Parliament meets in one form or another, in one location or another, from 1640 to 1660. It's called the Long Parliament. The Long Parliament refused to disband or go home out of fear that they would never be called back by Charles. So when the Long Parliament shows up in 1640, they ignore all of Charles' requests for money and soldiers. In fact, they use their time to legislate against Charles I. The first and best example of this is the Triennial Act of 1641. In 1641, the Long Parliament issued the Triennial Act, which stated that the King of England must call Parliament into session at least once every 3 years. In other words, they were telling Charles, enough of this 11 years of ignoring us, the representatives of the English people. Enough ignoring England. So Charles realized pretty quickly that the Long Parliament was not going to help him so much as hinder him. He used his friendships and some of his own personal money and acquaintances to put together an army to put down the revolt of the Scots himself. Parliament learns, of course, of Charles's ability to put together an army without them. They fear that after Charles uses his army to put down the revolt of the Scots, that he may turn on them with this army. They don't want to be left undefended. The Long Parliament creates their own army. This blows up into a conflict known as the English Civil War from 1642 to 1649. The English Civil War can be quite complicated, but for our purposes, we'll simplify it a great deal. What is most important about the English Civil War is who the sides were and what they were fighting over. The forces of the Long Parliament, that is, their soldiers sworn to defend the Long Parliament, were called the Roundheads. The forces of King Charles I were called the Cavaliers. What they are fighting over is the issue of sovereignty or power in England. In other words, the question to be answered in the English Civil War, 1642 to 1649, is who is most powerful in England? Is it a king or queen who has gained the throne through hereditary right? Or is it the Parliament, the people who are chosen to represent the nation of England? In 1649, the Roundheads were able to successfully capture King Charles I. They beheaded him. So for all practical purposes, it seems that in 1649, the question is answered definitively. Parliament is more important and more powerful than the king. In 1649, the word king is almost a dirty word. No one wants to succeed Charles I as the king. No one wants that title. It's associated with absolutism and with tolerance of Catholicism. The person who was selected to replace Charles I was a member of the Long Parliament and had served as a Roundhead in the English Civil War. His name was Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell establishes a government in England from 1649 to 1658 that is referred to as a Commonwealth. He referred to himself, however, as the Lord Protector of England instead of king, so sometimes the Commonwealth is also referred to as the Protectorate. What Oliver Cromwell was supposed to do, or had intended to do, in 1649 was to establish a form of constitutionalism for England, but he did not do that. It almost seems as though he got a little taste of power and liked it, and it corrupted him and went to his head, and he used the military of Parliament, called the Roundheads, to enforce some of his very unpopular acts and laws. And as a result, we often call Oliver Cromwell a military dictator because he used his military to enforce his policies. These policies included the right to bear arms for Protestants only. He forbade sporting events and theater, which is a popular pastime. Essentially, people could work and go to church, and that was about it. He also censored the press. The English people realized that what they had here as a military dictator was certainly worse than having put up with Charles I or James I even. While they could be aggravated with Charles I and James I, their daily lives were not as impacted under those two absolutist kings as it was with the reign of Oliver Cromwell as protector. They felt his daily presence when they tried to read a newspaper and knew that it was just the mouthpiece of Oliver Cromwell, that it was not truthful. They also felt the impact of Oliver Cromwell when they could not go to sporting events or attend the theater. People in England desperately wanted a change. In 1658, Oliver Cromwell died. The English people breathed a sigh of relief. Possibly something great will happen. Not yet. In 1658, Oliver Cromwell's son succeeds him. Richard is his name. He carries out his father's unpopular policies for 2 years before he is forced to step down by the Long Parliament. In 1660, the Long Parliament offers the throne of England to Charles I's grown adult son, Charles II, who is known as the Merry Monarch because of his happy-go-lucky, optimistic, sort of positive outlook on life. So, in 1660, we have what is called the Stuart Restoration in England. It's almost as if the English pretend that Oliver Cromwell and the English Civil War never even happened. They bring Charles II back to the throne of England. Charles II arrived in England in 1660 from his travels, he called it, which seems a bit funny to me. What he meant by that, it was just a better way of saying that he had been running for his life during the English Civil War. So when he arrived in England in 1660, Charles II said, "Oh dear, I hope I shall not have to set out in my travels again," meaning, "Oh dear, I hope I can get along with this Long Parliament who killed my dad, because I certainly don't want to have to run for my life again." Well, if you look at the reign of Charles II from 1660 to 1685, you can see he must have done something right because his reign was very long. In fact, he did do something right, at least in the short term. When Charles II arrived in England, I think we understand his number one priority is to get along with Parliament no matter what it takes. This is the same Parliament in the first year of his reign that was responsible for the execution of his father. Charles II almost practiced a policy of avoidance. with Parliament. In other words, the best way to stay on their good side was to avoid them. So he used 5 men who were members of Parliament. Their last names were Clifford, Arlington, Buckingham, Ashley Cooper, and Lauderdale. From the first letter of each man's last name, we call this organization he created the Cabal. He chose 5 men who were members of Parliament, Clifford, Arlington, Buckingham, Ashley Cooper, and Lauderdale, to serve as his advisors or cabinet. These men were responsible for creating a wonderful, harmonious, great relationship between Charles II and Parliament for about 10 years. They acted as mediators or liaisons between Charles II and Parliament. The two, Parliament and Charles II, rarely dealt with each other face to face. In 1670, the Cabal failed, however. In that year, Charles desired to have a huge sum of money. Parliament refused. Charles, looking for money, went to Louis XIV, the King of France, who offered up money, however much Charles II wanted, just with one condition, and that is that Charles II make all of England Catholic. Well, this was supposed to be a secret agreement, but it wasn't for long, and when the English people found out that their king, Charles II, was willing to sell away their religious freedom for money, they were outraged. But still, no one in England wants to go through another bloody civil war. So what to do? Well, Charles was aged and had only illegitimate children. He had actually produced no heirs with his queen, and by law, no illegitimate child could succeed to the throne of England. So what the English people hoped is that if they waited it out and Charles II died, perhaps he would choose someone that would be good for them. Well, not going to happen. When Charles II died in 1685, he was succeeded by his brother James II. Charles II chose his brother James II to be his heir. James II reigned from 1685 to 1688. So this certainly doesn't sound like he's going to have a very good time of it, and he doesn't. His reign is only 3 years long. Why? James II made no excuses for it. He was openly and devoutly Catholic. The English people are outraged, horrified, worried. They are Protestant. They do not want a Catholic leader. James II immediately shows his devotion to the Catholic Church by violating a law in England called the Test Act. The Test Act forbade Catholics from holding key positions in the government in England, in universities in England, as commanders of the army. This act was discriminatory, to say the least, against Catholics, but the English people liked it because they were majority Protestant. James immediately violated the Test Act, began appointing Catholics to major important positions all around England. But the English people still don't want a civil war. What to do? Don't know what to do. But suddenly, in the summer of 1688, even though they've put up with James violating the Test Act, they feel they have to act. They're compelled to act in the summer of 1688 because James II and his new wife had a baby boy. A son was born to them in the summer of 1688. The English people knew if they did not act soon, they would have a Catholic dynasty. James II was Catholic. He would certainly raise this newborn son to be a Catholic. That son would raise his children to be Catholic, and so on and so forth. And the majority of the people, again, as I've said time and time again in this lecture, were Protestant. This was not something they wanted to stand for. They leave it up to Parliament to fix this situation. Parliament compelled James II to do the right thing and to step down in what is known as the Glorious Revolution. In about a month period from December of 1688 into January of 1689, King James II stepped down from the throne of England, went to France to live out his life on the payroll of the Catholic King Louis XIV, and he gave up his throne in favor of his grown daughter Mary of Orange, which is a particular part of the Netherlands, and his son-in-law William. So the English negotiate with James II for a peaceful, bloodless exchange of power from December of 1688 to January of 1689. James II, a Catholic absolutist king, steps down in favor of his Protestant daughter and son-in-law, William and Mary of Orange. When William and Mary of Orange arrived in England in 1688, they were